What would you do if all you had left in the world were $3 and a grief so heavy it felt like a stone in your chest? What if you spent those last $3 on the one thing no one else wanted? A patch of dirt, a collapsed hole in the ground, a place synonymous with failure? The world would call you a fool. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten earth was a secret that would not only rewrite one woman's future, but the very map of the town that had dismissed her. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we tell the story of Jane Whittaker and the worthless claim that held a kingdom. Jane Whittaker arrived in the town of Promise, Dakota Territory, on the afternoon stage, which was really just a rattling wagon coated in a uniform layer of pale dust. She stepped down not with the hopeful energy of a settler, but with the quiet, weary stillness of someone who had nowhere else to go. She was 22, but the look in her gray eyes was older, worn smooth by a sorrow too new to have softened. Both her parents, taken by a fever back east within a week of each other, were now just a memory and a dull ache behind her ribs. They had left her with nothing but a small, worn satchel containing a change of clothes, a tarnished silver locket, and the last 3 silver dollars she possessed in the world. The town of Promise did not look promising. It was a handful of raw lumber buildings scattered along a wide, rutted street, a place that seemed to be holding its breath against the vast, empty prairie that stretched in every direction. The wind was a constant, a dry whisper that picked at the loose corners of her dress and carried the scent of dust and distant rain. She walked the length of the town, her worn boots sinking slightly into the deep dust. Men on the saloon porch stopped their talking to watch her pass, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal that made her pull her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Women, glimpsed through the windows of the mercantile, paused in their errands, their faces unreadable. She was a stranger and a woman alone, a fact that made her both invisible and intensely conspicuous. She felt their eyes on her back, measuring her, dismissing her. She had no trade to offer, no family to take her in, no money to buy herself a respectable place at the boarding house for more than a night or two. She had only a stubborn refusal to completely despair, a last ember of her father's practical nature that insisted on moving forward one step at a time, even if the path was leading directly into darkness. She found the land agent's office at the far end of the street, a small, cramped room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The agent, a man with a sweat-stained collar and impatient eyes, barely looked up from his ledger when she entered. She stood before his desk, a ghost in a dusty dress, waiting to be acknowledged. He finally sighed, putting down his pen. "Well, what is it?" he asked, his voice rough with annoyance. Jane cleared her throat, the sound small in the heavy silence. "I'm looking for a piece of land," she said. "Something I can afford." The man gave a short, humorless laugh, looking her up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs and the worn-out boots. "Honey," he said, leaning back in his chair, "land takes money. You got money?" She didn't answer, just met his gaze, and for a moment, the sheer force of her quiet dignity seemed to surprise him. He grunted, turning to a large rolled map on the wall, and the conversation that followed would set in motion a chain of events that no one in Promise could have ever predicted. The agent, with a dismissive wave of his hand, pointed to a small, insignificant square marked on the very edge of the territorial map. "There's the old Miller claim," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Dugout caved in years ago. Ground's no good for farming. Too rocky for grazing. Been on the books so long, the paper's turning yellow." Just then, the door swung open, and a large, well-dressed man named Silas Croft entered, bringing with him an air of smug ownership. Croft was the town's foremost land speculator, a man who bought and sold futures, who saw the prairie not as a home, but as a commodity. He overheard the agent and let out a booming laugh. "The Miller ghost hole! You trying to sell that pile of dirt, Henderson?" He turned to Jane, his eyes sweeping over her with open contempt. "Ma'am, you'd be better off throwing your money in the street. At least then some poor soul might get a drink out of it." Henderson, the agent, shrugged, clearly embarrassed but also deferential to Croft. She asked what was cheap. Jane felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "How much?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the agent, ignoring Croft entirely. Henderson hesitated, then named the lowest price he could imagine for a deed, a price meant as an insult. $3, he said, for the deed and the dust. It was every cent she had. Silas Croft laughed again, a sound like rocks grinding together. $3 for a badger hole. Well, I'll be. Jane looked from the smirking agent to the contemptuous speculator. Something inside her, a core of defiance she didn't know she possessed, hardened like iron. They saw her as a fool, a charity case, a piece of driftwood. They expected her to shrink away in shame. Instead, she reached into her satchel, her movements deliberate, and placed her $3 silver on the dusty counter. The coins made a small, clear, final sound in the quiet room. "I'll take it," she said. A stunned silence fell. Henderson stared at the money, then at her, his jaw slack. Croft's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He had meant to humiliate her, but instead he had watched her call his bluff with the last of her worldly possessions. She had bought the punchline to their joke. What secret could be buried in a collapsed hole in the ground? Was this the worst mistake of her life, or the beginning of everything? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Now, back to Jane, standing alone with a worthless piece of paper in her hand. Jane took the deed, a single sheet of paper with brittle edges, and folded it carefully, placing it in her satchel. She turned and walked out of the land office without another word, leaving the two men standing in a cloud of their own astonishment. As she stepped back onto the main street, the deed felt both impossibly heavy and utterly insignificant. It was hers. The joke was hers now. The whispers started almost immediately. The story of the orphan girl and the ghost hole claim spread through Promise faster than a prairie fire. As she walked toward the mercantile to spend the few cents she'd kept back for a loaf of bread and some matches, she felt the town's collective gaze settle upon her. It was no longer just curious. It was thick with ridicule. Women stopped their chatter on the boardwalks, their hands flying to their mouths to hide their smiles. Men lounging outside the livery stable nudged each other, pointing openly. Their laughter was not loud or aggressive, but it was everywhere. A low, persistent hum of mockery that followed her down the street. She kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending not to hear, pretending it didn't feel like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. Silas Croft emerged from the land office and saw her standing there. He strode over, positioning himself so that others could hear. "Well, miss?" he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I do hope you've got a strong back. You'll need it to dig your own grave out there." He chuckled at his own wit, and a few of his cronies joined in. Jane simply looked at him, her gray eyes clear and still. She offered no retort, no defense. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any angry words could have. He grunted, his face reddening slightly, and stalked off toward the saloon. As the small crowd dispersed, a figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alley. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in two long, silver braids. She was known in town as Mary Two Knives, a Lakota woman who lived apart from the white settlers, respected and slightly feared for her wisdom. She had watched the entire exchange. She stepped in front of Jane, her dark eyes holding a depth that seemed to see right through the girl's stoic facade. She looked at Jane, then at the dusty road leading out of town, then back at Jane. She raised one hand and pointed a long, slender finger toward the barren hills. "Some roots grow in the dark," the old woman said, her voice low and resonant, like stones shifting deep in the earth. "Don't be afraid of the soil." And just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and slipped back into the shadows, leaving Jane standing alone on the boardwalk. The cryptic words hung in the air, a strange counterpoint to the town's derision. Jane didn't understand what they meant, but the woman's tone had not been one of pity. It had been one of prophecy. The mockery stung, but the old woman's words felt like a shield, a secret she now carried against the town's scorn. Jane bought her small provisions and left the town behind, following the wagon-rutted track that wound its way west into the low, rolling hills. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The walk was longer than she expected, and the silence of the prairie was a stark contrast to the noise of the town. Here, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the cry of a lone hawk circling high overhead. Her small satchel grew heavier with each step, and the loneliness she had held at bay now settled over her like a shroud. This was it. This was the sum of her life. A dusty road, a worthless deed, and a chorus of laughter echoing in her memory. She thought of her parents, of their small, tidy home with its vegetable garden and the scent of her mother's baking. Grief, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm her. She pushed it down, focusing instead on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The land here was different from the town's flatter environs. It was broken country, creased with ravines and dotted with stubborn, rocky outcrops. It was land that fought back. Finally, as the light began to fade, she saw it. Set into the side of a low hill was a dark, gaping wound in the earth, half hidden by a thick tangle of sagebrush and weeds. A few rotted timbers jutted out from the collapsed mound of dirt like broken bones. This was the Miller claim. Her home. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. The dugout hadn't just caved in. It looked as if the hill itself had sighed and decided to swallow it whole. The air around it was stagnant, holding the smell of damp earth and decay. Disappointment, cold and bitter, washed over her. Croft had been right. She had bought a grave. She slowly made her way closer, pushing through the scratchy brush. The entrance was completely blocked by a fall of rock and soil. There was no way in. A few feet away, a shallow depression marked where a small corral might have once stood, its fence posts long since rotted away to nothing. It was a place utterly devoid of hope. As the last light bled from the sky, a profound sense of desolation settled upon her. She was utterly alone, miles from a town that despised her, with no shelter and no prospects. She found a relatively flat patch of ground a few yards from the collapsed dugout. Sheltered from the wind by a rocky ledge, she unrolled the thin blanket from her satchel, sat down, and drew her knees to her chest. The stars began to appear, cold and impossibly distant in the blackening sky. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her. She simply sat and watched the moon rise, a silent witness to the vast, indifferent beauty of the land that had now claimed her last $3. That first night, huddled in her blanket with the lonely wind as her only companion, Jane Whittaker felt she had finally reached the very bottom of the world. The next morning, Jane awoke stiff and cold, the pale dawn light illuminating a world washed in gray. The bravado that had carried her through the purchase of the deed had evaporated in the chill of the night, leaving behind a grim, practical reality. She had a piece of land, but she had no shelter, no food beyond the half-loaf of bread in her satchel, and no plan. For a long moment, she considered simply walking away, heading down the track toward the next town, becoming another nameless, drifting soul on the frontier. But the memory of Silas Croft's sneering face and the quiet, knowing eyes of Mary Two Knives held her in place. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not be broken so easily. She ate a small piece of the bread, drank sparingly from her canteen, and then turned to face the mound of earth that was her property. She had no tools, only her own two hands. She started with the smaller rocks and loose clumps of sod, pulling them away from the choked entrance. The work was brutal and slow. Her hands, soft from a life spent indoors, were quickly scratched and raw. The sun rose higher, beating down on her back, and sweat traced grimy paths through the dust on her face. By midday, she had managed to clear a small opening, just large enough to peer into the darkness beyond. The air that seeped out was cool and musty. She worked for hours, her muscles screaming in protest, her initial despair giving way to a kind of numb determination. She was not thinking about building a home. She was simply focused on the immediate task. Move this rock, pull that root, clear this patch of dirt. As she dug deeper into the collapse, she began to uncover more of the dugout's original structure. She found the top of a rotted doorframe and the charred remains of what must have been a hearth. The stones of the fireplace had been scattered by the cave-in. She began to lift them one by one, tossing them onto a growing pile. Most were rough, jagged pieces of fieldstone, but one, near the base of where the hearth would have stood, was different. It was a piece of darker, smoother basalt, squarer than the others, and it seemed to have been deliberately shaped. It didn't fit. The other stones were local rock, pale and sedimentary. This one was volcanic, foreign to the region. It was an anomaly, a detail that snagged in her mind. She paused, running her raw fingers over its cool, flat surface. Why would a poor homesteader, building a simple dugout, go to the trouble of finding and setting a single peculiar stone like this? It made no sense. For a moment, she was about to try and pry it loose, but a wave of exhaustion washed over her. It was just a rock. Her imagination was getting the better of her. She set the thought aside and continued her relentless labor, her body moving with a mechanical rhythm born of pure will. But even as she worked, the image of that single misplaced stone remained, a small, unanswered question in the back of her mind. Days turned into a week. Jane established a routine born of necessity. She found a small spring a half-mile away, refilling her canteen each morning. She learned to identify edible roots and berries, supplementing her dwindling supply of bread. And every day, from sunrise to sunset, she worked at the dugout. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. She had cleared most of the entrance, revealing a space choked with dirt, but recognizably a room. She had also uncovered enough of the support timbers to see that the remaining structure was dangerously unstable. One heavy rain could bring the rest of the hill down upon her. She knew she couldn't go any further on her own. She needed help, and help cost money. She took the one valuable thing she had left, the small silver locket with the tiny, faded portraits of her parents, and walked back into Promise. She sold it at the mercantile for a handful of coins, the transaction leaving a hollow space in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. With the money clutched in her hand, she didn't ask for a laborer. She asked who was the most honest carpenter in town. The mercantile owner, a grudgingly decent man, pointed her toward a small workshop at the edge of town. "Daniel Price," he said. "He's quiet, does good work." Daniel Price was a man who seemed carved from the same timber he worked. He was tall and lean, with sawdust in his hair, and a sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. He had lost his wife to cholera the year before, and had since kept mostly to himself, finding solace in the clean lines of wood and the simple logic of a well-made joint. He listened to Jane's request without a word of judgment, his gaze calm and steady. He didn't mock her claim or question her purpose. He simply nodded. "I'll come look at it tomorrow," he said, his voice a low baritone, unused to conversation. The next afternoon, he arrived at the claim, his old horse pulling a small wagon with his tools. He surveyed the collapsed dugout, his practiced eye taking in the precarious angle of the remaining roof beams and the fissure lines in the earth above. "It's a bad one," he said, not with scorn, but with a carpenter's frank assessment. He spent an hour inspecting the site, his silence a comfortable thing. He pointed out details Jane had missed, the way the original builder had used long-lasting juniper posts for the main supports, the careful way the stones of the back wall had been fitted together. "Whoever built this," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to her, "meant for it to last." Together, they began the painstaking work of bracing the structure, shoring up the weak points so she could safely clear the interior. As they worked side by side in the cramped space, a quiet understanding grew between them. They spoke little, but they moved with a shared rhythm, two lonely people finding a temporary reprieve in common labor. While clearing the dirt and debris from the floor near the hearth, Jane's shovel scraped against that same dark, smooth stone she had noticed before. This time she stopped. "Daniel," she said, her voice quiet. "Look at this." He came over and knelt beside her, running his hand over the stone's surface. He frowned. "That's not right," he said. "It doesn't belong." He took the pointed end of his hammer and began to carefully chip away the hardened dirt packed around its edges. It wasn't just a single stone. It was the cap of a small, carefully constructed cavity hidden within the foundation of the hearth. With a final pry, the stone came loose. Jane reached into the dark space behind it. Her fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and wrapped in what felt like oilcloth. Jane slowly drew the object out into the dim light of the dugout. It was a heavy iron key, its surface pitted with rust, but its form still strong and certain. The oilcloth it had been wrapped in was stiff with age, but had done its job, protecting the metal from the worst of the damp. There was no visible door, no chest, no lock that it could possibly belong to. It was a key to nothing. Yet, it had been hidden with deliberate care, tucked away behind a false stone in the heart of the home. Daniel looked from the key to Jane, a question in his eyes. "What for?" he murmured. A current of excitement, the first she had felt in months, coursed through Jane. This was not random. This was a secret. Together, they began a systematic search of the small earthen room. They tapped on the stone walls, listening for a hollow sound. They scoured every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Daniel stood in the center of the room, his brow furrowed in thought. A dugout like this. If they had a cellar, it would be in the floor. The floor was a mess of packed dirt, rubble, and loose stone. It seemed impossible, but Daniel began to pace, stamping his boot heavily. In one spot, near the back wall, the sound was different. Not a hollow echo, but a dull, solid thud. He stamped again. "Here," he said. They fell to their knees and began to dig with their hands, scraping away the loose earth. A few inches down, their fingers hit wood. They cleared a wider area, their movements frantic now, and slowly uncovered the edges of a large, flat door, its planks thick with age, set flush into the dirt floor. In its center was a heavy iron ring handle, and beside it, a keyhole clogged with soil. Daniel carefully cleaned the keyhole with a nail from his pouch. Jane held her breath as she inserted the old iron key. It slid in perfectly. With a grating shriek of rusted metal, the lock turned. They both gripped the iron ring and heaved. The door was incredibly heavy, but with a groan of protest, it lifted, revealing a square of perfect darkness and a flight of steep, stone steps leading down. A rush of cool, stale air, smelling of deep earth and time, washed over them. Lighting a lantern, Daniel led the way down. The cellar was small and stone-lined, impeccably built. It was a root cellar, but a fine one. On the far wall were empty shelves and old bins for potatoes and apples. But that wasn't all. At the back of the cellar, set directly into the earth wall, was another door, smaller and bound with straps of iron. It too had a lock. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. She approached it, the lantern light dancing on the rough-hewn wood. With a trembling hand, she tried the key. Again, it fit. The lock turned with another loud crack. This door opened not into another cellar, but into a chamber. It was a small, dry room, no bigger than a closet, but it was finished. The walls were planked, the floor was wood. It was a hidden office, a secret study. On a small, crude table in the center of the room sat a single object, a tin box, the kind used for deeds and important papers, secured with a small padlock. The iron key, it turned out, was a master. Its tip was shaped to also open the small lock on the box. With a final click, the lid sprang open. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry. There was something far more valuable. Lying on a bed of yellowed cotton was a thick ledger book, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a folded, official-looking document. Jane carefully lifted the document and unfolded it. It was an original territorial land grant, signed and sealed, not for the worthless few acres she had bought, but for the entire 320-acre valley to the east. The very same land that Silas Croft was currently dividing into parcels and selling for a fortune. The dugout hadn't been a home. It had been a hidden command post, the secret heart of a much larger claim. The discovery left them in stunned silence, the lantern light flickering on the pages that held the power to upend the entire town of Promise. The ledger, written in a neat, careful hand, detailed years of work on the larger claim. Fences built, wells dug, crops planted. The letters told a story of a homesteader named Elias Miller, a man writing to his brother about his hopes for the future and his growing fear of a ruthless cattleman who wanted his water rights. A man named Jedediah Croft, Silas's father. The last entry in the ledger was abrupt, dated 15 years prior. It simply read, Croft came today. God help us, they now understood. Elias Miller hadn't abandoned his claim. He had been driven off it. He had hidden the proof of his ownership in this series of secret rooms, hoping to one day return. He never did. Jane and Daniel sat on the edge of the open cellar door, the papers spread between them, the weight of the secret settling upon them. This was no longer about a worthless piece of land. It was about a profound injustice. But as they discussed what to do next, a shadow fell over the entrance of the dugout. Silas Croft stood there, flanked by two rough-looking men he employed. His eyes, small and hard, darted from Jane to Daniel, then to the open cellar door and the papers in their hands. A rumor must have reached him, a whisper about the carpenter spending days at the orphan's claim. "Trespassing, are we?" Croft said, his voice dangerously soft. "On my property." "This isn't your property, Mr. Croft," Jane said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "And I think you know it." Croft's face darkened. "That's a worthless deed you're holding, girl. A clerical error. I'm here to rectify it." He took a step forward, his men fanning out behind him. "You're going to pack up and be gone by sunrise." Daniel rose to his feet, placing himself between Jane and Croft. He wasn't a large man, but his presence was solid, immovable. "You need to leave," Daniel said, his voice low and even. "This is her land." At that exact moment, the sky, which had been growing heavy and dark all afternoon, opened up. A deafening crack of thunder shook the ground, and a torrential downpour began, turning the dusty ground to instant mud. The storm was a physical manifestation of the conflict, wild and violent. Rain lashed down, driven by a furious wind. Croft and his men were momentarily taken aback by the storm's ferocity. He glared at Jane, then at Daniel, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, before he and his men retreated, scrambling for their horses in the deluge. The crisis was not over. As the storm raged, a new sound reached them over the roar of the wind and rain, a splintering crack and a desperate shout. Peering out, they saw a wagon on the nearby track, one of its wheels shattered, tilting precariously into a ditch. A man was struggling to control his terrified horse, while his pregnant wife huddled in the back, shielding a small child. Without a second's hesitation, Jane and Daniel ran out into the storm. They helped the family, the shepherds, out of the wrecked wagon and guided them toward the dugout. They brought them into the relative safety of the main room, and then down into the dry, protected cellar. Jane shared the last of her food and her only blanket, her own fear and uncertainty pushed aside by the immediate need of this stranded family. Huddled in the lamplight of that hidden room, surrounded by strangers she had just rescued, Jane Whitaker wasn't just defending a claim. She was building a home. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a sliver of moon. The shepherds, profoundly grateful, spent the night in the shelter of the dugout. The next morning, Daniel helped Mr. Shepherd repair his wagon wheel while Jane entertained their small daughter, showing her the smooth, dark stone from the hearth. When the family departed for promise, they carried with them not only their repaired wagon, but a story of a fierce storm, a kind young woman, and a strange, wonderful house built into the earth with secret rooms. That story was the first stone in the rebuilding of Jane's reputation. The town had mocked her for buying a hole. Now they heard she had used that very hole to give shelter to a family in need. Meanwhile, Jane and Daniel knew they couldn't wait. With the precious papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, they took Daniel's wagon and made the day-long journey to the territorial capital in Yankton. They found the office of the circuit lawyer, a stern but fair man named Judge Alistair Blackwood. He was the kind professional they needed, a man who dealt in facts, not in rumors or intimidation. He listened to their story patiently, his face impassive, as he examined the land grant, the letters, and the meticulously kept ledger. He compared the grant number to the official records in his archive. For a long hour, the only sound in the office was the rustle of paper. Finally, Judge Blackwood looked up, his expression serious. "The grant is authentic," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of law. "It predates Jedediah Croft's filing by 2 years. According to this document, and the supporting evidence in this ledger, Miss Whitaker, you are the legal holder of the deed to the entire Miller claim, all 320 acres of it." He went on to explain that Silas Croft's claim was based on a fraudulent abandonment filing made by his father. The ledger and letters provided clear evidence of duress. The news was so momentous, so utterly life-altering, that Jane could only sit there, speechless. The journey back to Promise was quiet, the air charged with a future that had suddenly opened up before them. When they arrived, the news, sent ahead by telegraph from Judge Blackwood's office to the local sheriff, had already begun to ripple through the town. The chorus of whispers that had once followed Jane was now different. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. People saw her now not as a fool, but as a force of nature. Silas Croft was waiting for them, not with his hired men, but alone, standing in the middle of the street. He looked smaller, diminished. The legal notice had been served. He was not a man who fought losing battles. He looked at Jane, the penniless orphan he had openly ridiculed, and in his eyes was the bitter understanding that she had beaten him. He didn't apologize, but he didn't have to. His public humbling was complete. He turned without a word and walked into the saloon. A man whose foundation of wealth and power had just been revealed to be built on stolen ground. By the time the first snows of winter fell, the dugout on the Miller claim was transformed. With Daniel's skill and Jane's unwavering vision, the collapsed hole in the ground had become a true home. Daniel had rebuilt the entrance with sturdy new timbers, adding a proper door and a glass-paned window that caught the morning light. The main room was snug and warm, with a new, efficient stove where the old hearth had been. The secret rooms below were no longer hidden. The cellar was stocked with preserves Jane had put up from late-season berries, and the small, planked office had become her quiet study, a place to read and plan. The larger valley, now legally hers, lay dormant under a blanket of white waiting for spring. The town of Promise had changed too. Or rather, its perception of Jane had. Families began to make the trip out to her claim, bringing small gifts of pies or a sack of flour, their curiosity now tinged with reverence. They saw the warm light in her window and the steady curl of smoke from her chimney, and they understood. She hadn't just found a deed, she had resurrected a home from the dust. The shepherds became her first friends, visiting often. Outsiders, hearing the story of the lost Miller grant, began to arrive, interested in leasing parcels of the rich valley land from her for farming. She was no longer an outcast. She was the quiet, unassuming heart of a new and growing community. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the snow-covered landscape, Jane stood on the small porch Daniel had just finished building. He was beside her, sanding a rough edge on the railing, the simple, repetitive motion a comforting sound in the immense quiet. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the light fade. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine smoke and winter. They had worked together every day for months, rebuilding the dugout, fencing a small pasture, their lives intertwining as naturally as the grain in a piece of wood. A bond of deep affection and quiet trust had grown between them, a love that didn't need grand declarations. It was visible in the way he handed her a tool without being asked, in the way she brought him a cup of hot coffee as he worked, in the shared silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. He finally stopped his sanding and looked at her, his gaze soft in the fading light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Jane looked out over the valley. Her valley, the vast expanse of white and gold that held all the promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. A small smile touched her lips. "They thought I bought a hole in the ground," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I just found a place to put down roots." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He didn't say a word. He just held on, and together they watched the first stars appear in the deep blue winter sky. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage, a story that reminds us that true worth is often buried, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. If you were inspired by Jane's journey, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales of the frontier. We'll see you in the next story.